Good afternoon. So today we continue our class of coastal geomorphology. Previously, we came to know some of the processes, mainly the tide and waves, how they occur, what are the factors by which tide and waves are happened in the coastal areas, or particularly in the coastal areas of sea. Today we will learn some other processes as well as some morphological features found in the coastal areas. So, firstly, it is the plate tectonic process which fundamentally determined the shape, the bathymetry, and all the things of the marine medium. So, all you can see, it's a cross-sectional view of a shallow marine condition to deep marine condition, and whatever the features are, whatever the inclination, whatever the ups and downs found in the marine condition, these are mainly guided by the plate tectonic processes. Now the main plate tectonic process found in these coastal areas is the transition from oceanic crust to continental crust, or you may say otherwise, if you coming from the continental areas or land areas, it is the transition area between continental crust, the granitic crust, and the oceanic crust, that is the basaltic crust. And this transition area is marked by two geomorphological features in the marine condition. One is the continental slope, that is the oceanic most uh, component of continental crust. It is a relatively steeply inclined portion. The inclination is about 2 degree to 7 degree, and in the more oceanic part, that is a flat land area, where from the continental slope the slope again starts to be horizontal, more horizontal. So this portion is known as continental rise. So the junction between continental slope and continental rise, basically demarcating the uh, junction of continental crust and oceanic crust. Now the more, that is known as abyssal plain. So this is more or less a flat area, monotonous flat area, and generally the depth is about 4,000 meter and above. And in this abyssal plain areas, there are some mid-oceanic ridges, and in case of uh, convergent setup, there we found the deep oceanic trenches, which may occasionally go about 10,000 meter or even higher. We see that above the continental slope, there is again a relatively flat area. The inclination or slope is very less, about less than 1 degree or so. This part is known as continental shelf. The junction between continental shelf and continental slope, this area is known as shelf edge break. And beyond continental shelf, the more land part area is uh, in presence. So this is the area, the continental shelf and this land area. This is the area which is our studied uh, topic, uh, that is the coastal area. So we have to study this area and all the landforms produced here, mainly by different oceanic processes, and later they are modified by some aeolian activity of also. Now the most important thing is the zone, or often it is known as the line, but rather the line, it should be a zone which marks the contact between these ocean water and the land areas, is known as shoreline, and often it is known as coastline also. So this shoreline or coastline, whatever you say, this marks the junction or the transition from the land area to the oceanic area. Now If we consider the oceanic realm in terms of bathymetry, in terms of some numerical depth values, so starting from the shoreline or coastal line, the zone up to 200-meter depth is known as neritic zone. So this part is mostly the continental shelf area starting from the shoreline and ends at shelf edge break. So that is the bathymetric depth is about 200 meters. So it is the photic zone, and most of the organic activity is found within these areas. So this is the most habitable place or most habitable condition found in the oceanic realm. Apart neritic zone, the depth from 200-meter to about um, 4000-meter is known as bathyal zone. Below 4000-meter to 5000-meter, the known as abyssal zone. This is the zone of continental rise, and bathyal zone is the previously known continental slope area. And beyond 5000-meter depth, the zone is known as hadal zone. So this classification is based on the basis of some depth values. Now, if we look at more closely the continental shelf area or the neritic zone, there we found a lots of other divisions also, or a lots of finer divisions also. So from, if we start from the marine part, from shelf edge break, that is this point, to the storm weather wave base condition or storm weather wave base depth, this portion is known as the offshore part. That means it is the distant part from the shore. Far seaward portion of the neritic zone or far seaward portion of the continental shelf is known as offshore, and it is bounded by shelf edge break at one end, and at the other end the storm weather wave base. The portion storm weather wave base to fair weather wave base, this is known as offshore transition. The portion above the fair weather wave base up to the mean low water condition, this is known as shore face. And the portion from shore face to the continental limit, that is the mean high water mark, or from the up to the shoreline, that is known as foreshore region. So if we move from land to the oceanic part, we encounter first foreshore, then shore face, then offshore, and then offshore transition, and then finally offshore. All these areas are restricted within the continental shelf area. Now, depending on wave divided into several zones. In the previous class, we came to know that how waves generate, and as the waves approaching towards the coastal areas, um, the wavelength between two successive waves gradually decrease when the wave base hits the bottom substrate, and as a result, the amplitude or the height of the wave increases. Gradually it goes up and moves more faster than the bottom portion, so it takes this kinds of curly nature, and ultimately it breaks uh, over the water body. So where the water or this wave breaks, that zone is known as breaker zone. Now after breaking of the wave, this water gradually rolls over the surface, that is known as surf zone. So often we came to know that the peoples are surfing in the coastal areas. So they are mainly doing their activity in this area where just after the breaker zone, that is they slide through some um, pads or through some wooden material through from these high altitude or highly elevated wave breaks, and gradually they slide past through these zones. So from that, the zone is named as surf zone. And after that, towards the extreme land most areas, there the water just uh, move or rolls in a very thin film that is known as swash zone, and the going back into the water is known as the backwash. So from that swash backwash, the zone is known as swash zone. Now coming to the activities or different processes occurring in the coastal areas. First is the erosion occurred in the coastal areas. The erosion occurred in the coastal areas done in different processes. The first process is known as attrition, where the materials which are carried by the waves or the seawater, they mutually collide with each other, and therefore they often broke and often form a smooth rounded surface. Though, so these kinds of mutual colliding of wave-borne particles with each other is known as attrition. Uh, Erosional process is known as hydraulic action. This process involves the force of water against the coast. As the wave of water approaches towards the coastal rocky mass or coastal substrate, then this water enters into the fractures in the rocks, and the air within those fractures, they suffer a high compressive pressure due to the sudden infiltration of water within those cracks. Now, when the wave retreats, that's when the water comes out from those cracks, suddenly those compressed air expands very quickly, and this causes a minute explosion sort of activity, and that results um, a fragmentation or further fracturing of rocks. So when this process occurs repeatedly, ultimately it causes disruption or breakage of the substrate areas or coastal rocks. The third process is the corrosion. Here mainly the chemical activity is found to occur. That is the marine seawater is reacting with the coastal rocky landmass, and mainly if the coastal or if the seawater is slightly acidic and the coastal rock body is like in carbonate in composition, then the reaction is found to be occur maximum. Although there are other kinds of rocks are also present and they also affected by these kinds of chemical reactions, but in that cases, apart from carbonate, the chemical reaction is very slow, almost negligible. So chemical action of seawater is most profuse in the carbonate rocks. This type of uh, weathering or erosion is known as corrosion. And the last process is known as the abrasion or corrosion. It is the process by which the coast is worn down or broken down into finer materials or smaller fragments simply by the sheer um, thrust of the waves. So wave directly impact on the coastal rocky landmass, coastal substrate, and all the materials carried by the waves, they are also fallen with a high energy on the coastal substrate or coastal rock mass, and due to this impact, the rock body is fragmented into smaller particles, and this is known as abrasion or corrosion. Now, a coastal area, whether there is the activity of erosion is more dominant or the coastal area suffers more deposition. So depending on the balance between erosion and deposition, because every coast there is some sort of erosion is occurring and some sort of deposition is also occurring, and depending on the dominance of whether erosion is prevalent or deposition is prevalent, the coast is divided into two types. The first one is the constructive coast. As the name suggests, you can very easily understand that here, apart from the erosion, deposition by strong showers, that is the surfing of water towards the land mass, is more dominant. So, uh, because of the more active or dominance of SOAS rather than backwash or other kinds of erosional activity by coastal water. Mainly deposition occurs here rather than erosion. So deposition is the prevalent process, deposition is the dominant process found in these areas. So that is why they are known as constructive waves, or often known as constructive coast. The second type is known as destructive. You may well understand that here, apart from deposition, erosion is the main dominant process. So erosion is greater than deposition. That is why the most of the coastal landmass, most of the coastal rocky substrates, they are affected by the erosional activity of seawater, and thereby dislodged from their original position. That is, they are eroded. So these kinds of coast is suffering by removal of coastal material, by removal of rock mass from its original position. So that is why they are known as destructive waves, or known as destructive coast. Now the landforms mainly found due to coastal erosion in these coastal areas are mainly three types. The first one is headlands and bays. Second is cliffs and wave-cut platforms. And the third one is caves, arcs, stacks, and stumps. Now here you can see within these three headings there are more than one feature. Uh, these features are grouped into these uh, one heading because these processes are mutually related. So headland is related to bay, cliff is related to wave cut platform, and these four are mutually related to each other. So that is why overall these all these features are subgrouped into these three headings. Now I coming one by one. So first is the headland and bays. Now you all know what a bay is. We are very much familiar with our Bay of Bengal. That is, a bay is an area of water which is surrounded in its three sides by land areas. If you see the position of Bay of Bengal, you may find these kinds of continental landmass surroundings. So here is the Burma and all other countries. Here is the southern part of India, and this is the West Bengal, Odisha areas. So this portion of water, which is surrounded in its three sides by continental landmass, this type of uh, occurrence, or this type of landform, is known as bay. Simultaneously, in the side of bay, you may find a landmass, in this case this one and this one, which is also surrounded in its three sides by water, marine water. Say for example, the southern end of India. If you look at the southern end, the Tamil Nadu, Kerala, in these states, this landmass of India is surrounded in its three sides by marine water. So these are known as headlands. So headland and bays are occur due to the same process, and they occur side by side. Now the question comes, how these landforms are produced. These kinds of landforms, that is headland and bays, are formed due to differential erosion in the coastal areas mainly. Sub, say for example, if in the coastal areas the rock mass or the rock layers occur in a parallel way, and they particularly occur perpendicular to the coastlines, and they occur alternately. Say for example, in this case the dark green portion is the hard rock and the light green portion is the soft rock. Again, the dark green portion hard rock. So with time, these all these rocks are directly affected by the coastal processes, by the wave attack. So as the middle portion, the light green portion, is the soft rock, so definitely erosional activity is more prominent in this condition. So this portion is more scoured, this portion will be more eroded, and it forms these kinds of um, inundation, these kinds of curvature within the landmass, through which the sea is more encroached towards the landmass. And ultimately, this portion is occupied by sea, which is surrounded by in its all three sides by the landmass. So this forms bay, and just at the side you may find a resistant hard rock which is less prone to erosion, and this hard rock portion is covered in its three sides by marine water. So these are the headlands. So particularly these headlands and bays occurs in side by side, and particularly they occurred when there is a alteration of soft rock and hard rock found along the coastlines, and these rocks occur more or less perpendicular to the coastline, and that results differential erosion in the soft rock as well as in the hard rock. Next is the cliffs and wave cut platforms. Now, cliffs are the high land areas found just near the sea. Often we have a concept that only where these kinds of vertical wall is found near the sea areas, we call them as cliff. But that may not be so. The cliff may be a gently inclined surface also. That may not be a near vertical surface. It may be a gently inclined surface or gently sloping surface. And whether the cliff surface, this sloping surface, which occurs in the coastal area, it will be gently sloping or steeply sloping. That depends on the resistivity power of the these kinds of rocks. So when the rock material is made up of hard rock that is more resistant, it forms these kinds of vertical or near vertical slopes, and when they are little soft, so they are more prone to weathering and thereby eroded, they form gently sloping cliffs. Now, the erosion in these coastal rock mass exposed areas is happened mainly by the wave activity. So you can see in this picture also that wave activity is more pronounced in the bottommost portion, where the regular waves and tidal waters hits this bottom portion of the slopey surface, and due to periodical or repeated activity of waves or tidal waters in this bottommost portion, so erosion mainly occurs in this bottommost part, and they are formed a wave cut notch, that is a indentation, that is a groove within the um, highly sloping, highly inclined rock surface in the coastal areas. Now with time this notch gradually increasing its depth, and after some time the above material which is hanging over this notch, it loosens its resistivity. That means it becomes unstable and rock falls occur, so it collapses, and this collapsed material, these broken rock particles, now came into direct activity of the regular swash and backwash found in the foreshore areas, found in the coastal areas. So they are regularly churning, regularly worked out by the waves, and gradually they are spread out throughout these coastal areas, and they form a nearly horizontal to very gently sloping flat land area which is called wave cut platform. So mainly in the coastal areas, the erosion or the breakage of these vertical rocks, uh, the vertical exposed country rocks occurs with starting of these kinds of wave cut notched at the bottommost portion of the wall. Gradually they are accentuated. With time the hanging portion of the rock becomes unstable and it collapses by rockfall, and these collapsed broken particles, they are churned regularly by the wave water and dispersed throughout the foreshore region, throughout the coastal areas, and forms a very gently sloping to almost flat area which is known as wave cut platform. Now Here is the step-by-step process. The wave cut platform is formed when the following processes. The sea attacks the base of the cliff between the high and low water mark. The wave cut notch is formed by erosional processes such as abrasion and hydraulic action. As the notch increases its size, that is, it becomes more deeper within the rock mass, more encroaching towards the land mass. The cliff hanging over it becomes unstable and collapses. The backwash or swash carries away the eroded material, and regularly churning here gradually disperses along the coastal areas and formed a flat land or almost gently sloping surface, which is known as wave cut platform. And the process occurs repeatedly. And due to the repeated occurrence of these processes and the effect of uh, wave erosion in these cliff sections, gradually the cliffs exposed in the coastal areas, they are retreating. So they goes far inland uh, due to this wave cut processes. The third type of landforms is the caves, arcs, stacks, and stamps. Generally, this is also occurred by the wave activity, where the coastal rock mass already exists some kinds of weak planes. That means already exists some kinds of fractures, some kinds of joint planes. Now, these joint planes or these fractures are the areas where the activity of wave is more and more prone, and these are the areas where weathering and erosion due to the wave activity is most commonly found, because the superficial area in these areas, due to the occurrence of the fractures, they are became the accessible areas of the wave activity. So more and more surface area is exposed along these fractures, so wave activity is more pronounced in these fractures or in these joints. Now, with pronounced wave activity in those cracks, gradually these cracks becomes widened, and it forms these kinds of caves, these kinds of hollow openings. Now, with time, these caves are also accentuated, these caves are also increasing their size and shape, and they form a narrow pathway from one side to another side. Then this is called arc, and the hanging portion over this arc, that is the roof of this arc, is known as the headland, or actually this entire landmass, as the in the first process we know that this is the mass which is surrounded in all its three sides by the ocean water, that is the headland part and these kinds of features are mainly found in these headland portions. So in case of arc, the caves system is more accentuated, and you may find a path, a passage by which you can move or you can go from one side of the headland to the other side. This becomes a narrow passage, narrow pathway. Now with time, when the shape of the arc or the size of the arc increases, the roof over this arc becomes unstable and gradually collapses. So as the roof of arc collapses, in the frontal part, you may find a isolated rocky part, which is previously in connection with the headland. These kinds of vertical, eye-shaped, isolated rock mass, which is formed due to enhancement of arc and collapse of the arc roof, is known as stack. Now, with time, this stack is also eroded and gradually lowers its size and forms stumps. So, ultimately, in the headland areas where the wave activity is more pronounced in from all these three sides, and if the headland areas rocks exist some kinds of fractures or some kinds of joints, that is some kinds of pre-existing weak planes, so those are the areas where activity of wave is more pronounced, and with time erosion occur more and more and forms caves. Then caves transfer to arcs, that is a passageway from one side to the other side of the headland. And collapsing of roof produce some isolated ice-shaped rock mass that is known as stack. With time, with erosion, the stack lowers its size, lowers its height, and produce stump. So again, due to the enhanced wave activity for a long time, the original headland part is again retreating due to these kinds of fracture enhanced erosion by wave activity. So these are the processes. First, any kinds of cracks, there are the areas in the headland areas through the erosional process or particularly the hydraulic action and abrasion are the dominant process. These cracks are accentuated and it begins to open up to form a cave. The cave becomes larger with time and break from both sides to make a passageway within the headland. And this is known as arc. If the arc is significantly longer than the width of its entrance, the term is sea tunnel also called. So sea tunnel is one kind of arc where the length of the arc is greater than its width, and the base of the arc continually becomes wider and wider through further erosion. Ultimately, the roof becomes unstable and it collapses into the sea. This leaves a stack, an isolated column of rock. The stack is undercut at the base by the wave activity and gradually collapses and reduces its height, reduces its size, and ultimately forms stumps. So these are the main landforms found in the coastal areas, mainly done by the coastal processes or mainly done by the wave activity. Thank you.